Thank you for being with us here again at our weekly Bible study at First Baptist Church of Lancaster. You know, there's an old children's rhyme that nearly all of us learned as children, and apparently it came originally from somewhere in the mid-19th century, and it says this: "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Now, as a kid, I remember saying that maybe a couple of times, or maybe somebody saying it to me after either an insult came my way or came from me to another kid. And as an adult, I recognize it's one of the dumbest adages that ever came out of the mouth of a human person. I've had a good life as far as I've been pretty injury-free, but I've had my share. I had a broken left hand, had a broken right hand, a torn left Achilles tendon. I've had more sprained ankles than I can remember. I've had a strained and partially torn hamstring muscle, bumps, bruises, cuts, scrapes, a couple of concussions, bloody noses, and a few black eyes. But yet today, there really is no perceivable residual effects from those injuries. But words, it's a different story. I can remember as far back as the first grade with a teacher that was kind of one of those old school rough people saying something to me, and all the time in between, experiences or incidences that now when I think about them, I relive them, and immediately returns to me the sense of pain or humiliation or a low feeling, and usually accompanied by some degree of anger as well. So the fact is that it seems that it's as fresh today as it was back then. Makes me wonder about the healing that has happened to those wounds. So words can and do hurt. Now, why is that? I think it's because we care so very much about what other people think, and we are sometimes held hostage by the words and the opinions of other people. And we're living in an age where words seem to be, hurting words seem to be the norm rather than the exception. There seems to be a total loss of civility when it comes to the public forum when a dialogue has been replaced with criticism and name-calling and finger-pointing and personal attacks rather than, respectful debate. And really it's been modeled by all of our political leaders at all levels of government. And Americans have become social media crazy, and it seems that somehow it brings out the worst and the insanity of people because, why not, I guess, because they can say the most horrible things to people, whether they know them or not, with relative impunity from the comfort of their own home and protection of their own home. I never imagined before having children and with the anticipation of having grandchildren that they would have to deal with something as powerful and as potentially destructive as what we refer to as cyberbullying. In some cases so vicious and so unrelenting that there are cases where our own children are taking their lives just to escape the words. So it's really a verbal jungle out there today. Now, thank goodness for the sanctuary of the church, right? Well, I want to pick it up in where we left off last week in Philippians 1, 12 through 18, and let me read this. And I'm going to recap part of what we studied last week to go into what we're studying this week. It says, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the advancement of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident as a result of my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some, indeed, preach Christ even from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice, and yes, I will rejoice. Now, Paul is a man full of joy despite his circumstances that he finds himself in, because, as he says, that first of all, the word has spread throughout all the Praetorian Guard and all the rest, and it's because of his imprisonment, because of his chains. It's not because of sedition or insurrection or breaking of the law or crimes against humanity or anything like that, but it's strictly because he is suffering for Christ. It had a tremendous effect on those outside of the church in Rome, because it had actually reached as far as the palace and the household of Caesar with the gospel. And so many of those were added to these small bands of followers that dotted Rome at that time, followers of Christ. But there were also some internal effect as well. Many of the brethren were emboldened by Paul's fearlessness to speak more boldly than before. They saw his situation was dire, as it was, and witnessed his fearlessness and his joy despite his circumstances and despite the danger he faced. They saw that God was moving as a result of Paul's homebound ministry, and they were encouraged by what they had heard from testimony of others, or maybe what they'd seen by witnessing this great apostle. His courage became their courage. So many of the brethren were preaching with more zeal and less fear because of Paul. But Paul distinguishes between two groups that were emboldened to preach Christ without fear. Some who preached out of love, meaning love for Paul. Those who loved Paul and saw him languishing under house arrest, chained to a Roman guard, but they saw how God was moving even in his imprisonment, even as his change, and they became confident, is the word used there, and that comes from the Latin word, means to trust fully or completely, to trust God completely. They had a love for the Lord, they had a love for Paul, and it motivated them to carry on Paul's ministry. But there were those which were motivated by what Paul refers to as the erytheia. The New King James Version translates this word as selfish ambition without any real sincerity. Now, this word erytheia originally just meant working for pay, but came to have a negative connotation because it was considered that the person whose only motivation is to work for pay had a very poor motivation for working. The intention is only to benefit themselves and their own gain and prestige and advancement above any concern for anyone or anyone else or anything else. A person who kind of made a career out of their own self-interest. Now, as would seem very natural to us today, the word eventually came to be connected with politics, and it became to mean canvassing for office, with the associated traits of being self-seeking and having selfish ambition. One who was determined to advance themselves no matter what it took to get ahead, to beat the competition. Now, there were those who saw Paul's imprisonment as an opportunity to advance their own influence and power and prestige, and maybe to advance their own little group or their little church group within Rome. They saw it as an opportunity to scramble up the ecclesiastical ladder in Rome. Their concern was not with the church, maybe not even with the people, and maybe not primarily with the spread of the gospel, but their interest was self-interest. But Christ was being preached. Now, what was Paul's response? To preach a series of messages condemning their insincerity, to publish a pamphlet defending himself and warning others with the names of other pastors from all over Greece lending their word of endorsement, or to tell everyone else that he could no longer associate with these fakers? No. What was his response? What then? So what? It doesn't matter to me what the motivation is as long as Christ is preached. Now, we'd initially be perplexed, sort of the nonchalance that Paul had in talking about these people, especially in light of what Paul says in Galatians 1, 6 through 8. He's talking about others there in the Galatian church. And he says this, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting Him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is not another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be cursed. As we've said before, so I say again, if anyone is preaching a gospel contrary to the one that you received, let him be cursed. Now, why the great disparity in the reaction? You see, those in Rome were preaching true doctrine, but with wrong motives. Those in Galatia were preaching false gospel, or rather adding something to the gospel, so they were preaching or teaching heresy. Now, what I want you to understand about those people in Rome, they were Christians. Now, they were carnal, they were kind of living in the flesh, but they were Christians and they were preaching sound doctrine. They were just doing it for all the wrong motives. And Paul's attitude, that's okay. At this stage of my life, all I really care about is that people are hearing the true message of Christ. Now, when Paul was writing to the Corinthian church in his first letter to the Corinthians, and they were having divisions and fightings among each other because there were factions that were following different spiritual leaders. And in chapter 3, verses 3 through 9, he says this, For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, and another says, well, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul? And who is Apollos? But ministers through whom you believed as the Lord gave to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God gives the increase. Now this follows right on the heels of what Paul says earlier in this letter in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, where he says this about his own ministry and about himself. He says, And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. As one old commentator put it, the power is in the gospel, not in the gospeler. Now, does this happen today? Absolutely. There is envy and jealousy and selfish ambition and rivalry. There is combativeness and divisiveness and a lack of cooperation between churches for the spread of the gospel. There are factions and splits and a general us against them attitude between denominations and sometimes even within denominations. I was struck by a study that was done, an estimate done by Gordon Cromwell, a very conservative Protestant school, that estimated that there are now over 40,000 different Protestant denominations worldwide. Now, keeping in mind that we just recently celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, that means that in 500 years, we've managed to divide and subdivide to where there are 40,000 plus denominations in Protestant denominations. So let me ask you, how was Paul able to have such an attitude for those who were trying to increase his suffering and his pain by envy and selfish ambition? Christ was so central to him. Jesus so occupied and controlled Paul's personal world that he no longer cared about his circumstances or about his possessions or about power or prestige. He didn't care what people thought about him or what others accomplished for that matter, or whether they recognized him more than them or them more than him. It didn't matter. There was no envy on his part because there was no self-serving pride in him. It's a matter of historic record that the two English evangelists, John Wesley and George Whitefield, disagreed on doctrinal matters, and both of them were very successful, preaching to thousands of people and seeing multitudes come to Christ. It was reported that somebody asked Wesley if he expected to see Whitefield in heaven, and the evangelist replied, "No, I do not." "Then you do not think Whitefield is a converted man?" "Oh, of course he's a converted man," Wesley said, "but I do not expect to see him in heaven because he will be so close to the throne of God and I so far away that I will not be able to see him." Now, folks, though they differed in certain matters, there was no envy but a celebration of their ministries for Christ. Now, Paul goes on to say this in verse 19 through 21. He says, "For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be ashamed or disappointed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Now, the word translated deliverance is the Greek word soteria, which means to save or to preserve or salvation or deliverance. That could mean that Paul was talking about his deliverance from jail. He was going to get vindicated in his next trial. But that's probably not the case because he just almost immediately says he doesn't know if he will live or die. It could mean it's eternal salvation, which Paul had a confirmed hope in that. But the word can also mean just a general well-being. So I think it may be a combination of all those. That Paul is saying that it could be that I am in this situation, put here by God, for my welfare here on earth, to forge my faith, to give me all the more confidence through your prayers of fellow believers, provision of the Holy Spirit, that my hope and my surety of both the now and the future won't be disappointed at all, so that I can face any situation that may come, whether death or life, because my hope, my faith, my mind, my life is fixed on Christ. I have Him and He has me. And who can separate me from the love of Christ? Now, according to William Barclay, the word translated expectation is a very unusual word. No one had used it before Paul, and in fact, he may have coined this word. The word is apokaradokia. Apokaradokia. I'm sorry, I should have pronounced that. Apokaradokia. Now, the prefix apo means away from. Kara means the head. And dokein means to look. And together it means the eager, concentrated, intense look that turns its gaze away from everything else to fix it upon the object of its desire. And when I hear that, I can't help but think about Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. It says, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and every sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run the race that has been set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." One Christian who was under fire for taking a stand on biblical truth that is no longer popular endured much criticism with grace and said this: "The truth I think I understand and for which I must stand up is in reality a truth that I should stand under and which I should look up to. To the point again in the language of hymnody, in such moments, I prefer the song, "Beneath the Cross of Jesus, I long to take my stand," rather than stand up for Jesus. C.S. Lewis said this in his work, Christian Behavior. Hope is one of the theological virtues. This means that a continual looking forward to the eternal world is not, as some people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things that Christian is meant to do. It does not mean we are to leave the present world as it is. If you read history, you'll find that those who did the most for the Christian world were just those who thought most of the next. It is since Christians have ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this one. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. See, Paul's perspective, Paul's value, Paul's world was held together by the man, the God-man, the Son of God, Jesus. Chuck Swindoll shared this story. He said, a man came home from work, tired, beat down after a long day at the job with the prospects of another grinding day the next. He sat down to relax in his comfortable chair, watch the game and read the paper and leave it all behind for a few hours, when suddenly his 4-year-old son jumps into his lap and says, "Hi, Dad, let's play." Suddenly he was stuck. He loved this little boy more than life itself, but he just needed this break, and he didn't know what to do. Then he noticed in the paper a large picture of the Earth taken by the astronauts as their capsule had circled the moon, circled the moon. And so he had an idea. He took the page with the picture of the Earth and cut it up to many, many small pieces, many of which looked all the same, and took it to the kitchen table with Scotch tape and said, "Now, son, I want you to put the world back together." And then he went back and sat down to relax, happy with his ingenuity. 5 minutes later, the little boy came back with the picture. And he said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, Dad, it was easy. On the back side of the picture was a picture of a big man, and when you put the man together, the world came together." Now, Swindoll goes on to say this. He said, that's exactly the way it is with Christ. When you put the God-man together, the world comes together. I want to ask you, are you working on the wrong side of this puzzle we call life? Let God, let Christ put the picture together. Thank you for being with us. God bless you. Have a great week.